Now, Culture Club with Melanie Oliveiro on CNA938.
It's time for a fabulous, or should I say, Fab Four drenched Culture Club this hour. Welcome to CNA938. I'm Melanie Oliveiro. Let's come together and listen in on a story about a very special story, I must say, and a very unusual one, especially when you throw these three factors together. First one is Imelda Marcos, the First Lady of the Philippines, the wife of the controversial and authoritarian leader Ferdinand Marcos. The Beatles, the uber-influential supergroup from the 60s, whom many consider still the greatest band of all time. Inefficient tour organizers, managers, and others involved in the Beatles' ill-fated and only trip to the Philippines in the late 1960s. So with these three main factors and more, considering the geopolitical climate at the time, they all proved a major snafu that was responsible for the Beatles declaring they would never tour again-ish. Anyway, this fiasco is well documented in the book You Won't See Me, When the Beatles Ghosted Imelda, written and researched by David Guerrero, who is half British, half Filipino. In it, Guerrero documents the dramatic story of the Beatles' ill-fated 1966 visit to the Philippines to play several concert dates there, and also a strategic marketing move to expand into new markets. But things went pear-shaped for the Fab Four, Paul McCartney, George Harrison, John Lennon, and Ringo Starr, when they snubbed an invitation to meet First Lady Imelda Marcos. This naturally sparked official outrage, and this turned the Beatles' visit into a frightening ordeal marked by hostility and intimidation, and with little help from their friends. My chat with author and ad man, not tax man, David Guerrero will highlight key moments of the Beatles' headline-grabbing visit, but let's visit his childhood first. David, how old were you when you first discovered the Beatles? For me, it was when I was about maybe 3 to 4 years old, when my father, my dad, was playing songs from A Hard Day's Night. And he bought the LP, A Hard Day's Night, in Australia when he was studying in the 1960s. So that's how I discovered them when I was younger. What about you?
I think we had very similar experiences, actually. I was given a copy of Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band by my dad and told to go and listen to it for a whole afternoon, which I did, and sat down on the living room floor with the record playing over and over again, with me reading the lyrics and probably not understanding any of them, but enjoying the music.
How old were you and when was that?
Okay, this is really giving away my age at this point, but I was 9 years old.
In the 60s or 70s?
In the 70s, just on the cusp of the 70s, yes.
So yes, you're a big fan of the Beatles. Take us back to the idea for writing this book and how it came to you, David, because I understand it became a BBC documentary of sorts, and before it became parts of your Harvard master's degree as well. Paint that picture for us.
Okay, so I grew up in England, Filipino father, English mother. So I've always had both sides of this story in me. And being based in the Philippines now for the last 30 years, I have also increasingly come to wonder quite what happened on those fateful days in July 1966 when the Beatles turned up in Manila at the height of their fame. And it all started so well, and then it all went so horribly wrong. So I really wanted to get to the bottom of that. And there wasn't a lot, or there hasn't been a lot of literature about it. So I was drawn to that subject, and it took me longer than I thought it would to get through it. But I believe I've got something now which is advancing our understanding of what happened. It may not be the final word, but it's certainly, I think it's taking us a step forward. These two sides of my family, in a way, were coming together in this story, was something that was quite personal to me, but it was also something that it seems was a good way to be able to talk about the country in a way that the rest of the world would find interesting.
Yeah, because it brings together these two countries, these two cultures, which is where you're at as well. Okay. Yeah. Can you tell us then about the research you did? Because you have extensive records, you've gathered them, no doubt, and it did take longer than you expected. I'm talking about exact dates to names of the tour personnel, to the times their flight landed and departed, even the label of the paisley shirt Ringo Starr was wearing on the plane in 1966. So very, very exact, very comprehensive. How did you gather all of this?
Well, I started off with all of the available published sources of literature, all the secondary sources. And it's sort of what one of my tutors called, slightly dismissively, a clippings job. Okay, so I went through all of the archives, all of the published newspapers, all of the firstly available ones, and then the books, of which there are quite a few. But then I thought, I need to go deeper and do some original research and really try to track down as many of the people who had been there at the time and talk to them. And actually, since I've started this process, some of them are no longer with us. So it was kind of a race against time to reach some people and say, tell us what you remember, tell me what it was like, tell me how you felt seeing them. And in the process, I've talked to people who have never really been heard from before. There are people who have never been interviewed about it before. That was fascinating. And I think the other thing I've done is do a bit of a comparative job of just saying, okay, so this person says this and that person says that. Who are we to really believe here? Who's corroborating who? And some of these things we may never know.
Yeah, because there are conflicting recollections here. Not only when it came to people on the ground, people who lived it, even when it comes to the Beatles themselves recollecting.
Absolutely, yes. So I think even some of the management team as well as sort of have dropped out of the sort of official history of the band. So there's this sense that there's an official history, which you will find in these beautiful documentaries like the Beatles Anthology. And you look at it and it's so captivating. And you think these are the people who were there at the time and they must know what they're talking about. But there are other people who were there who are not mentioned, if you like, or not given any coverage. So there's that kind of wider, slightly outside that circle that you need to look and you need to say, okay, that person is no longer in the story, but they were part of the story at the time. So, what are we to think about that? And is it just there wasn't room for them, or was it that their story didn't really fit a kind of narrative that they wanted to tell? So there's that.
Well, you mentioned the Beatles Anthology. I have the entire set on DVD. And just reading through this book, you're going to make me want to watch it. I haven't watched it yet. I bought it some years back, but I'm definitely going to make a date with the Beatles Anthology DVD set. You also mentioned that some people have already passed, have left us. Who would they be, the fans or some of the organizers?
Well, one of the things that happened when the Beatles went to Manila was that after they left the airport, after they had their press conference, they were then put on a boat, was described as a luxury yacht, and then taken out into Manila Bay. In the anthology, when you go back and see it, and there's a new remastered set done by Peter Jackson, you see on streaming, one of the things they say, we have no idea why we were put on a boat. It seems a mysterious thing. But it's pretty quick to discover when you research it that it was their own management who arranged this boat. So it was not sort of some mysterious thing. It was like there was actually part of the plan. So there's things like that where there's a little bit disingenuous, some of the management to say, oh, we don't know why we're on this boat. Actually, the guy who was kind of airbrushed out of the history was the guy who arranged the boat. And then he was sort of sidelined after this tour and never heard from again. But this guy, Vic Lewis, who was the international tour manager, had gone there previously and made this arrangement. So things like that. Anyway, the person I talked to was the host of the band in that yacht. So she was the fiancée of the guy who owned the yacht. And this young couple, they're in their early 20s, very well-off couple, and they'd sort of decided that they would host the Beatles aboard their yacht, and they served them dinner, and it was all very wonderful until it wasn't. But then she was willing to be interviewed about it and said how polite and pleasant the band were, and what they had for dinner, which was shrimp cocktail, some steak.
Yeah.
And then they had whiskey and other things aboard the boat. So she described it in great detail. Unfortunately, and probably about a year after I interviewed her, she succumbed to COVID. I guess it was just a reminder that yes, when you have living witnesses to history, you need to talk to them as soon as you can because you never know what's going to happen down the road.
Well, things went pear-shaped from the start. It started off promisingly, but things went wrong pretty quickly. The Fab Four was greeted rather menacingly by military types. They were shouted at. But George Harrison complained, and he said some things. And in this day and age, because I read his remarks, they could be interpreted as borderline racist, if not outright. Ringo wasn't too happy either. What he said wasn't tasteful.
Yeah, I mean, I think when you see footage from the era, when you look at recordings and the sort of things that are being made, you realize just how long ago the 60s were and how things have changed in 60 years. So yes, there were a lot of things that I think would have got them cancelled in this day and age.
Yeah.
I think knowing the context, knowing what happened, you can understand what went on. But it's worth, I guess, surfacing some of these things so that we can get a sense of what it was like. I think.
Well, he was frightened.
Absolutely. I think there was a very militaristic tendency to this thing because there was so much fear that something would go wrong, that essentially something did go wrong because they were so afraid that something was going to go wrong.
Yeah.
So it became very militaristic. The press conference was held in the headquarters of the Philippine Navy, which is on the bay. So that's the first thing. And again, done because they were worried about these tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of fans that might try and storm another venue. And then, of course, there's taking them out on a boat to, again, sort of trying to deter these, all these sort of passionate fans. And, there's a headline in the newspaper, if you want to see the Beatles, you're going to have to swim, man. So there's all this kind of stuff. So this desire to prioritize the security actually ended up causing more problems than it solved. So then they're stuck out on the boat. There are 4 bedrooms that are made up. However, Brian Epstein, the 5th Beatle,
the manager.
Yes, so he didn't like the fact that there was only 4 proper bedrooms made up. So he was immediately agitating to get off the boat. And then when the brother of the host turned up with a bunch of friends, that was really the final straw. And then they were taken off the boat and brought to the Manila Hotel at about 4 a.m, which is when they checked in. Yeah. Not the ideal preparation for a big concert the next day.
Yeah, because they were really hungover the next day as well. Let's talk about the fans you managed to meet, like Josie Leorado, the fan club president. These fans were persistent, starstruck bunch. Some even got to meet the Beatles at their hotel. They must be in their 70s, thereabouts right now?
That's right.
Yeah.
That's right. They were all about between the ages of, say, 14 and 19 at the time. So this is 1966.
Yeah.
And they're still talking about those days as if they were yesterday and recounting every bit of it. Josie was the head of the Beatles fan club of the Philippines, which is not the oxymoron that it sounded like later, but she was really passionate about the band and actually went to the promoter's office before the concert and said, if you don't get me a ticket, I'm going to jump out of the window. So she became famous for saying that. And of course, they got her a ticket and she ended up getting another ticket as being a head of the fan club. So she was that passionate about it. And she managed to get in through the official channels to have an official meet and greet with Paul and George after the concert when things had already started to go wrong. But anyway, she was there and she brought her camera, but the flash didn't work, and you just think how these kind of things used to happen in the past where you didn't have easy availability of picture recording devices. And of course, it wouldn't happen now. There'd be selfies galore. But yeah, at that time, she didn't get a picture, but she's got the memory.
Yeah, it was the 60s after all. I mean, even if it was the 80s, you had your point and shoots and your disposable cameras. It would have been much better even in the 80s.
That's right.
There is a blow-by-blow account of the various reasons why the Beatles did not go to meet with the First Lady of the Philippines, Mrs. Marcos, Imelda Marcos, at the Malacanang Palace. How do you think things could have been handled better for them indeed to meet with the First Lady and for things to be even pleasant, even fun for everyone?
I think it all started with the fact that there was a different international tour manager to Brian Epstein. And Brian had delegated this job to somebody else. And this guy had come in and made a lot of arrangements. And then when they actually arrived, Brian wasn't happy with the arrangements he made and basically went back on all of them. So that morning, after they checked into the hotel at 4 a.m., these guys turned up from the palace, an official delegation of very high-ranking officers and the son of a minister, and expecting to be, collect the band and bring them a very short distance away to the palace. It was only about a kilometre away, and they just weren't ready for it. They sort of knocked on doors and everyone was saying, yeah, what? We're not going anywhere, and it was all very hungover. They weren't there. They didn't know about it, weren't really ready for it, didn't feel like it. Got to get ready for a concert in the afternoon. Lennon was saying, we didn't even know they had a president. Who's this president? And so there was this sort of a lot of banter and a lot of cheekiness, which didn't go down well with the rather sensitive head of security. So one of the things that he said was, you've got to come to the palace. You've got to give a special performance for the First Lady. And one of the Beatles, probably John, said, if she wants a special performance, she can come up to our room and we'll give her one there. And this didn't go down well and sort of stirred up a lot of anger later on with security guys. All of this was unknown to the fans and no one knew any of this. And all this came out later, but that was one of the triggers, I think, for an official backlash against the band.
So it really boils down to miscommunication, really.
I think, it goes back as far as the original invitation to go. So, there must have been an invitation that got to the band a week before when they were in Tokyo. And there was, in some of the accounts, they said, we'd got the invitation, but we hadn't done much about replying to it. And another account more recently said, the ambassador of the Philippines to Japan came to see us, but we told him we definitely wouldn't go. These are all contradictory statements. And there was a kind of an understanding within the Philippines that they would come. And so the newspapers, when they arrived, said, the First family are going to go and see the concert, and the Beatles are going to pay a courtesy call on the First family. So it's all very out there in terms of what was expected. But none of that, this being the 60s and there being no internet and there being no instant communication between countries and things and people relying on telegrams or whatever, none of that had reached the band, or at least reached them in a form in which they could understand and accept. So I think there's a lot of assumptions, a lot of thinking like, well, they haven't said no, so they must be coming. Or they haven't said no, and I think we can just divert the bus via the palace on the way to the concert and they'll just go with it. And I think there's a lot of wishful thinking like that.
Clash of egos as well, I found.
I think, yes, it's interesting. I don't think the First family were used to having anyone say no to them. And I don't think the Beatles were used to being forced to do anything they didn't want to do.
Yeah.
So, what should we say? A force, an immovable object.
That's right. That's right.
So there was perfect storm of misunderstanding.
Perfect storm.
Yeah.
Also a storm in a teacup, but you know what? People are still talking about it decades later. David, I like little stories like the original painting that Paul McCartney bought from a Filipino artist who's very, very much respected. Someone called Ben Cabrero or Ben Cab. Paul was fond of sightseeing and shopping back then. He didn't really believe in drinking into the early morning hours. He wanted to be right as rain in the morning to go sightseeing. But tell us about that painting. Its title alone made people snicker back in the day. Yeah?
Yeah. So this was when the official delegation was at the hotel expecting to pick up the band, and Paul had gone out early that morning and done a bit of sightseeing, as you say, and had discovered an art gallery quite close to the hotel and took a fancy to a painting that was on the wall. It's a landscape, and the title was Fishing in Sesmoan. But the way it's spelt, it's Sexmoan. So it was a funny title for it.
So fishing in Sexmoan.
Exactly. so the town later changed its name because it didn't like being laughed at. But that was the title at the time. And so I don't think he bought it because of the title. He just liked the look of it. And he bought it for all of 70 pesos, which at that time was probably about maybe $10, let's say. And,
US.
Yeah.
Okay.
And it is now worth in the region of at least 2 million pesos. So this is a painting by a future national artist. So it was just happening. It shows that Paul had pretty good taste when it came to art.
Yeah.
And the artist himself would have been there, except he'd gone out for breakfast or wasn't around, and his brother sold it to him. And when he came back, he said, "Oh, I've sold one of your paintings." Some guy from the Beatles. He goes, "What?" And I wasn't here. So anyway, so there was all this kind of funny drama that happened.
Funny dramas throughout their trip there.
Yeah.
What individual stories about John, Ringo, and George in Manila you liked when you unearthed these stories?
there's stories about the concert itself, where the other musicians were talking about how George was really considerate about unplugging and replugging guitars so that he'd turn the volume down on the amp so there wouldn't be a sort of loud noise or whatever. And so there's a lot of stories about how they were admired for their conduct on stage. There was a kind of admiration for how they played and just the whole incredible sense that they were there. This is the biggest band in the world, and they are right here, right now, playing in Manila. And there was a real excitement about that, which again is still tangible today. You still hear people talk about that. There's people I meet all the time who said, I was there, or, my dad was there, or somebody, somebody they knew was there. So it really covered a lot of people. And the concert was huge. I mean, there were 2 concerts, and in those days, the bands just played for 30 minutes. And they had a concert in the afternoon, which had 30,000 people in attendance, and the one in the evening, which had 50,000. And that combined audience of 80,000 was the largest in a single day the Beatles ever had. In a sense, it would have been the biggest rock event in the world up to that moment. So it's an extraordinary moment to take place. And of course, it was totally overshadowed by what happened the following day.
But no archival footage, yeah?
There is some archival footage of the outside of the concert. So you'll see that on YouTube if you sort of look it up. But the audio is not accurate on that. The audio seems to have been taken from another concert. And then there's some stills. There's some stills available of the stage itself.
Which we can see in your book, You Won't See Me.
Yes. Yeah. Yes, absolutely. And again, some of these things, I'll be able to expand on some of them on my website and on future posts on my yet-to-be-launched Substack, which will happen soon. Yes.
It'll happen, okay.
Yeah.
Brian Epstein's behavior, from his reaction to the palace invitation to apparently mistreating a support act, Pilita Corrales,
yes,
very much respected in her home country. He wasn't in a good headspace there.
Yeah, according to Bob Spitz, who's one of the major biographers of the Beatles, I mean, he alleges, and it seems likely, that Brian was quite strung out on various drugs at that point, and he was not in a good place. And this did lead to some erratic behavior. I think one in his stubbornness about not going to the palace, and he had the British embassy ringing him up saying you should go, and he had half of his team saying you should go, and he's saying no, definitely not, we're not going. And then, as you say, during the setup for the concert, he sort of was quite rude to one of the support acts, say, get off the stage, lady, it's time for the Beatles to come on. There's quite dismissive of some of the local artists. So yeah, that didn't go down too well, but they were able to stand up for themselves and just told him to, where to put it, and it was all okay. Yeah.
Tell us about the wildest rumors about the Beatles' stay in Manila that you managed to set straight.
I think the wildest rumors were that they were somehow imprisoned or, sort of forced onto this boat in the bay. And I think that was clear that was an arrangement that the management had made. I think a lot of the rumors, though, turned out to be true. I think, they definitely were, sort of refused room service the day after the concert by the hotel. And there's tentacles of official displeasure kind of spread to every aspect of their lives. I mean, it went from, we tried to order room service and none turned up. Some turned up and the food wasn't edible. The tax man turned up with a big bill, that would kind of wipe out most of the concert takings. I mean, the one that everyone talks about is when they get to the airport with all the equipment and the luggage and all this stuff to carry up the stairs. The escalator they're about to step onto is suddenly and mysteriously switched off. And then all the roadies have to kind of lug these heavy equipment up in the afternoon heat, upstairs. And so there's all this kind of some petty, some major passive aggressiveness or outright aggressiveness in some cases that they had to endure. Again, this is all about context. When you pull out and see where the Philippines was at that time, the country itself was, 19 years into independence. And at that time, the year 1966, Singapore is 1 year old.
Yeah. China
is going through Mao's Cultural Revolution. No other country in Southeast Asia would have even let them in the door. So I think there's an interesting, at that time, this was the epicenter of pop culture. The two countries that would allow the Beatles in, Japan, not without controversy, because the Japanese didn't like them playing in the Budokan, which is normally reserved for martial arts. And the Philippines, of course, trying to maybe be too friendly by saying, come and meet our president and first lady, come to the palace, and not maybe getting the arrangements right. But initially, the impulse, I think, was a really good one, and it just fell apart. So yes, but when you look at the broader context, I think Indonesia had banned the Beatles at that time. I don't think Malaysia or Thailand were very keen. This was their bridgehead into Asia. And it was unfortunately not one that they felt like coming back to, but it was not for lack of trying, I think, that they didn't make it, but it was just couldn't happen at the time.
What about Australia?
Australia, they had a huge and very successful tour there in 64. Yeah, I don't think they felt like going back after they decided to stop touring. Obviously, that was it.
Yeah.
I mean, there were funny stories about Australia, but that's another story.
That's another book.
That's another book. Somebody else can do that one.
Not you?
No.
Okay. Yeah. Apart from finding out what the Beatles got up to, the reader will also get to know the Philippines a lot better as well. You provided a brief but informative history of it being colonized by Spain for about 300 years and later half a century by the Americans.
Yes.
And also like how the preponderance of guns was a result of the Spanish colonizers using guns and violence to keep the Filipinos in check and under their rule. So I found all of that very, very fascinating because you just worked this in, you see.
Yeah, I felt I needed to give some context. And, again, I felt it'd be a way to put a historical lens on this. The often told summary of Filipino history is 350 years in a convent and 50 years in Hollywood,
That's
right?
right.
It is often said. And it tells you quite a lot about the exuberance of the country, but also this, difficult and, as you say, violent history as well, which, again, that's just the other bit of historical context is that in the middle of 1966, America is ramping up its presence in Vietnam, and the Vietnam War is reaching its height. So there's a whole sort of military perspective to the whole region. There are tests of atom bombs and H-bombs going off in the South Pacific. France is letting off giant nuclear devices in the middle of, we're not too far from all of us, as it would have been. So, when they say, what's with all the guns? I mean, it's just the whole region is in quite a lot of turmoil at that time. And that was part of it, So this was and I don't think they really knew where they were going and what they were getting into. I think these days, I'm sure bands, when they travel, they've got this whole security analysis, political perspective, sort of a report. Yeah, they've got people telling them what to do, what not to do.
Yeah.
Back then, it was like, it's just another date. Just like anywhere else. We're just going to turn up, play a concert, go home.
It's a business now.
That's right.
They're business entities now.
That's right.
They must be protected at all costs. You love the Beatles, of course, David. The question is, and since it was mentioned in your book, You Won't See Me, my question for you is, do you have a copy of the Beatles' Yesterday and Today compilation album, nicknamed The Butcher Cover, featuring the band in white butcher outfits surrounded by raw meat and decapitated baby dolls? This piece of history, slice of history, withdrawn, recording a withdrawn record all over in certain key markets. A collectible, quite rare. Do you have it?
Sadly not, because it was probably quite valuable. That album, and it was the first sign, that not everything they were doing was perfect, okay? And of course it was impossible. And this was up until that point, and this is kind of happening by 66, up from, 1963, 64, when they just hit superstardom. Up until 66, everything they touched was turning to gold. Every record was going to number one. Every concert was sold out. Adulation, global fame, absolutely conquering all before them. And so with all this desire for more of them, so everybody wants a piece of the Beatles at this point. And then everything they do, people thought that they could do nothing wrong. And then at some point, they're probably getting bored and they start to experiment and they say, okay, well, let's do this concept album cover, very 60s concept thing when they're sitting with white coats and these decapitated dolls and everything. And the record company prints 600,000 copies of this cover and distributes it all over America. And then they start getting complaints from everyone. And they just probably wake up and say, what are we doing? And they bring it all back and they change the covers and everything. But they'd gone along with it that far because they had just so much trust in the band. And I think it's just, the pressure of being at the top for that long. But you're going to experiment and you're going to try things and not everything's going to work. This is when they start to pull back a bit and they start to think, well, touring is a grueling experience. It doesn't help us musically.
Yep.
It doesn't. Our music's getting more sophisticated and more experimental. We just don't want to do it anymore. And Manila was the moment where they said, as the plane took off from Manila Airport, that's it. We're not touring anymore. Okay. And you'll see this in the Beatles anthology. And then they absolutely insist. And then Brian says, well, if you pull out of your next concert in Shea Stadium, it's going to cost you $1 million. Oops. Okay. We'll do the few more that's left in the States. But by August 66, they have stopped touring forever. And the very last concert was in San Francisco, Candlestick Park. And that's it, the month after Manila. And so the real moment they decided to stop was just as they're taking off from Manila and they're saying, that's it, we've had it. And they just kind of are obliged to do the other concerts, but they've already checked out by then. And it led to Ron Howard's film, 8 Days a Week, said that the touring was great, but when they stopped touring, the music gets even better. And the first singles after the tour are Penny Lane and Strawberry Fields, double A side, arguably very, very close to the best work they've done. And then Sgt. Pepper's, which is, again, not uncontroversially, but usually people say that's the masterpiece they've done. So again, I know you're shaking your head there, but there is certainly a big outpouring of creativity when the touring stops.
But would you want to pay a lot of money? Because you've reached a stage in your life, David, where you probably could maybe afford it. Would you buy a copy of Yesterday and Today?
The thing is, there are serious collectors of Beatles stuff, and I'm not sure I need to be one of them. I feel like there are things that I do treasure from this experience. I have a newspaper cover, actually the entire newspaper of the day after they leave Manila, and it just says, Mob manhandles Beatles, the front cover of the Manila Chronicle with a picture. And I just love that. I'm going to frame that and have it on the wall. I've got a couple of other articles from there. So my interest is quite focused on this experience in the Philippines and just that clash. So I think if I was going to collect anything, it would be more of the original materials and media from that time. Otherwise, the universe of Beatles memorabilia is too large, too expensive, too impossible to contemplate. So I'm just going to focus to my little corner.
We've been getting back in time across the universe, the space-time universe, that is, with British-Filipino author and ad man David Guerrero, who wrote You Won't See Me When the Beatles Ghosted Imelda. It's out in stores and online. And see what he's up to on Instagram as he takes his book all over the region, saying hello, goodbye to new fans and readers and followers as he hops from country to country. This has been Culture Club on CNA 938. I'm Melanie Oliveiro.